Hello, and thanks for joining us today on our webinar on social learning. I'm James Wright, and the head of learning design at Kineo.
I'm Jez Anderson. I'm the head of consulting here at Kineo.
I'm Krista Woodley. I'm one of the learning consultants here in the consultancy and design team.
And we're looking forward to talking about social today, and hopefully you'll be joining in with us as well with lots of chat using the chat facility. I notice some people have been communicating already, and that's great. We also, in the spirit of social, are going to do a number of polls. We've already done one, and we'll feedback on that in a second. It's very interesting results tonight. And also, if you'd like to sort of chat and tweet throughout, there's our hashtag KineoChat, please do so, and we will sort of comment as we go through. So, really, in the spirit of social, we'd like you to communicate with each other and with us as much as possible, and we can sort of try and discuss things a bit from that. So what are we going to try and do today? Well, we're going to have a look at what's meant by social learning, because it's not always clear, and sometimes open to interpretation. And we're also going to discuss some high-level approaches to social. I said that I don't think, if I'm honest, that we're going to come up with any hard and fast solutions, because I don't believe that necessarily that is where everyone is at the moment. What I do hope we'll do is open it out a bit so that people will be sort of better equipped to go away and do something about it. So first up, I'm going to hand that over to you and respond to your poll.
So just looking at those results from the poll, it's around 69% of people, the majority of people say that there's so much fuss about social learning because of the availability of new tools and software, but there's also the idea that it's in fashion, and also...
Hi, I'm just going to interrupt because I can't hear the sounds kind of thing. Can you write in the question box, does it sound clearer when I stand over here? Does it sound better? Somebody just said, okay, so it's significantly better here, which means our mic isn't working. I apologize for that inconvenience. Is it bearable with the sound coming out of the computer? Okay, so we'll just move the computer closer to you guys, okay, and we'll go with that. Does that sound good? We'll just scoot over this way. Yeah. Apologies for that. Our mic is not choosing to work. I'll see if I can get it working, but for the time being, we'll just rearrange how we're sitting.
Okay, so thank you, Kelsey, thank you for sorting that out. So I was just saying that the poll results were, the majority of people said that the interest in social learning now is about the availability of social tools and software, but there's also a significant proportion of you that are saying the interest is passion, but also, very importantly, that people are doing it anyway, people are using social learning anyway, so let's make the most of it. So, back to you, James.
Yeah, picking up on commenting on that poll, there's it's the technology that gets the top vote, isn't it? Which is interesting because the technology gets the top vote, but actually I think the main thrust of this webinar today is actually on the other side of social, which is the people side, and so how people can be encouraged or facilitated in making best use of that technology. So before we go any further,
so if people could put into the chat their definitions of social learning, because I know James mentioned earlier that there are different understandings of the of what we mean by social learning. If you could type in what your definition of social learning is, that would be great. Jez, back to you.
Okay. So we've been doing quite a lot of thinking around this, as probably a lot of people have, and a lot of people in our position have been doing. And as we all know, there's an awful lot of being written about it, being talked about. Those of you that were at LearnTech will have probably been to conferences or some of the small workshops where social learning was a theme, if not a main topic. And it's something that I think has captured imagination within the learning technology sector in particular. I'm relatively new to the sector, but I've worked in learning and development for over 20 years, but I'm relatively new to learning and development, to technology sector. So for me, what I wanted to understand was what was meant by social learning, and I've spent quite a bit of time just trying to unpack it a little bit, just so I can almost start to reconstruct it from a learning technology point of view, and how best to support organisations get the best out of the technologies that are available to them to support and embed and develop social learning within their organisations. So starting point, it's always good to look at a starting point, back to brass tacks, and look at what the dictionary said, which is, as I say, my experience, probably not a bad place to start. So social, what do we mean by social? Relating to society, needing companionship, an informal social gathering. Great. Things that we do all the time, things that make us who we are as people. Some of us really enjoy it, some less so, some of us do it very outwardly, some of us do it more inwardly. But invariably, everybody has some social networks and social contacts through which they share. And learning, the acquisition of knowledge and skills through study, experience, or being taught. I come from an action learning sort of background, and I look at how do people learn through experience and make the most of those experiences. So I think for me, personally, a lot of people get a lot of experience, a lot of learning through the experiences they're having day in, day out. So it's about putting these two things together, and by doing that, it gives us a really good starting point for our discussion. Not just today, but more generally around what we mean and what we feel by social learning. So, what does KINEO mean? What have we stated as our definition? How knowledge and skills are acquired as a result of the social interaction with others. Ultimately, this is about, regardless of technology, regardless of the methodologies that we use, regardless of the systems and processes that we create, ultimately what we're trying to do is understand, enable, empower organisations and people to get something from each other, to use their social networks, to use that social interactivity that happens naturally, that is part of our day-to-day life, part of who we are as people. It's the things that go on around us all the time, and we've done this since the beginning of time. If you looking at cave paintings on walls which depict how people lived, how they hunted for food, it gives a really interesting and insightful picture, not just of that moment in time, but also as a learning mechanism, as a way for which how people acquired skills, acquired knowledge, and then shared that with other people. And obviously now we live in a technology age where that's what ultimately is a modern cave painting. So using technology to share, to support how we develop and grow. To me, social learning is implicit, it's informal, as I said, it takes place all the time, and it's the technology that facilitates that, it's the technology that helps that happen. So over history, there's lots of examples of how communities of practice, how communities of learning have used those social interactions, those informal social interactions, to develop and grow. And I think ultimately what we want to try and do is understand how technology can be harnessed better to improve that, to enable people to share that knowledge and experience. So what I'd like to do is just spend a minute just looking at an example, if you like, of social learning, which is probably low tech. Well, it is low tech, and it's pre-Web 2, pre-probably e-learning as we know it today, and it comes from Xerox, and it was written, a case study that was written in the Harvard Business Review back in 2000, and a very interesting one, and one that's been referenced lots in academic papers about communities of practice and how organisations share knowledge, how they support the engagement of knowledge, how decisions are made within businesses. and they're very much looking at learning processes. So the example focuses around Xerox employees who, basically the customer service representatives or engineers, who went out to organisations to fix the photocopying machines. Very traditionally organised in formal ways, using very formal methodologies of sharing information, task sheets, manuals, system maps, etc., which detailed in, gave lots of detail about how to solve those problems. But Xerox decided, well, Xerox spent some money deciding, and some time from their own research centre, wanting to understand how learning took place within the organisation, so they could improve it, so they could understand how they could move from to supporting their global system. And they looked at one particular group in question, and this one group, what they soon noticed from them was that they moved beyond the simple map that was provided by Xerox. So they moved beyond the task sheets, the manuals, the system maps, etc. And as they say, they went to breakfast, literally. It wasn't that they stopped working down tools, it was that breakfast became an important part of how they shared knowledge and how they shared experience. And the study looked at a group of engineers who informally, on their own bat, before their work started, would meet up at a given diner, and they would have breakfast together. And as part of that ritual, that process, they were sharing knowledge and sharing information about their job. They were collectively problem solving, they were asking questions of each other, they were laughing at the mistakes that each other had made, but they were also looking at helping each other solve problems. So it was actually using this informal process of learning that helped impact on what they were doing day to day. So very quickly, Xerox recognised that this informal approach, this informal need for sharing information, couldn't necessarily be documented. It was very difficult to document in the fashion that they were used to, in a formal way. And it was about how do you build a collective body of knowledge which is organic, which can be built and grown on. Xerox took this and they created something called the Eureka Project, which basically looked at how to oversee knowledge dissemination throughout their global networks and 25,000 staff. So in some ways it was the first example of pre-web-based social learning organised and managed by an organisation. The paper goes on to discuss if you over-engineer something, there's a risk that it collapses. And I think that's something, a topic that we'll touch on later on in this discussion. But ultimately, I think it's a nice example of how social learning has been around work and has been around us for quite a long time, and it's something that we want to build and grow. So I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to just quickly talk about a more high-tech solution, which is a good example of where social learning is.
Thanks, Jez. That was an example of social coalescing around breakfast time. You can eat breakfast. You can't eat technology, but technology can eat you. Just thought I'd throw that one in. Anyway, so if the Xerox example was a low-tech example, I think there's a fantastic example on the internet right now. So the high-tech example of social in that sense, and I think that's Stack Overflow, which is a fantastic site on the web. It's basically a community, an online community for programmers, 6.5 million of them plus, and so it's quite a mature sort of site. It's just a great example of learning. It's 6.5 million people all helping each other to learn. But I think also it sort of throws out in the whole thing of what do we mean by learning nowadays anyway. Stack Overflow is a site where people basically post up problems and they're solved by their peers. So basically, is learning really nowadays more about problem solving? Is learning more about performance support? Is learning in fact really about helping each other and sharing? rather than learning being a much more sort of a formal definition of learning as in the past. The other great thing about Stack Overflow is the way that it's so self-perpetuating, and it has an inbuilt quality control. You basically, by helping people and being sort of recognised as being good at it, and having valid and truthful content, you are rated gold, silver, or bronze. And it's much more granular than that. I mean, they're the kind of gurus, the gold, silver, bronze gurus. But actually, these comments you can see here on the screen sort of goes to show how kind of nuanced the comments on the quality of your content can be. It's just really where I think social can get to.
Great. Thanks, James. So if we just have a quick kind of report back on the chat and the definitions of social that you've been giving us, thank you for those. I mean, there are some fantastic answers in there. There is learning through collaboration. Thank you, Pravina, and I think that really sums it up in such a lovely, simple way. And also, I think very interestingly for what we're about to cover next, Melina says working with binding communities, and I think that's a really lovely way of putting it, this idea of binding people together to form communities. So, if I just move on to the next slide, just keeping those definitions and keywords in mind, I'd like to talk us through a very quick case study and show how one of our clients has had some fantastic results with social learning, with incorporating social learning in a program. They've won 2 awards for it, and they've had some fantastic concrete results for the business. So, just to outline the initial problem, the data indicated that there were some areas of customer service that needed improving, and there were big pockets of good practice, but they needed sharing more effectively. So, the L&D team identified 3 core areas where improvements could be made. That was helping colleagues share best practice across the business, supporting those colleagues in building new networks with their colleagues, and increasing the recognition and value that was held in collective and collaborative problem solving. So, with our client, we helped to identify that the opportunity was to build the practice of knowledge sharing rather than work on individuals' knowledge. So, looking more widely across the business, the L&D team discovered that there were readily available social tools that were being used in other parts of the business and that were providing real value there. So, after careful consultation, the L&D team decided to deliver a campaign that included social learning, starting with a communications and engagement campaign setting out to engage hearts and minds first. So, the solution was a campaign focused on how a change in approach could improve customer experience and help improve performance. So it used a drip feed of emails, posters, briefings and social channels to roll out the concept of the change programme. This was followed up by a short piece of e-learning, culminating in a social call to action. And so through both online and offline collaboration, individuals and teams worked on posting, commenting and rating ideas to help improve service. So working at a team-by-team level, individuals were encouraged to share examples of good practice, asking questions and offering solutions for others. In terms of the results were really impressive. After a relatively short period of time, it was quite obvious, the success was quite obvious. There was a substantial reduction in customer complaints and a visible increase in the traffic across the internal social channels. And so this program for our client has been such a success that they're now rolling it out to 26,000 employees across their organisation. Back to you, Jez.
That's good. An interesting and probably a really good example of 70-20-10 framework and framework thinking. And I'm sure, like many of you listening in, 70-20-10 has been bandied around, a bit like social learning. It's one of those phrases, one of those keywords that we chuck in. And this webinar is not about 70-20-10. But what it is about us understanding how social fits in with maybe the other frameworks that exist around learning and around how we learn in the workplace and how we support learning, importantly, in the workplace. So I'm going to ask this question. The poll's live, I see. So where do you think it fits? Where do you think social learning fits in the framework? Is it informal? Is it situated? Is it collaborative, supported? Is it more formal, more didactic in style, or is it all of the above? I'll just give you a few more seconds to respond until I get a thumbs up from my colleagues, and then we shall move on with my answer.
Well, I think it looks like a pretty even split across 70, 20 and all. Slightly more people are saying all of the above. 52% at the moment.
52% all. Cool. Okay. Interestingly, our take on the world is 100%.
Oh,
we
no.
think oh, has it shifted?
Sorry, it just shifted and to the 20%. But sorry to interrupt you.
So where we think it fits is that social is really all within the framework. Although the commentators talk about 70, 20, 10, and they talk about, you know, that 70 is informal, 20% is social and collaborative, 10% is formal. The reality of the world is that whenever we're learning, and even in formal or informal learning situations, we're social animals and we're talking, we're being part of social networks, as I said before, all the time. So ultimately, for us and to me, socially is really what it means to be human. So to actually try and categorize it, to control it, to segment it, is missing the point a little bit about what social and learning really means. As to, you know, we're doing it all the time. So the question in my mind, and the question in my mind as we've been debating this here, has been, well, if that's the case, what is our role and what is technology's role in supporting, enabling, and empowering social learning through technology? And that ultimately is where, I suppose, where we come from, is to think that really what we should be trying to do is look at the culture, look at the behaviours, look at how we nurture people to tap into that social drive that we have, and enable and empower them to do that within the workplace and to share that learning, to share that knowledge. We ran a survey, and when we asked people how do they share knowledge, how do they problem solve, an outstanding and a high majority of them, over 70%, talked about, actually we do it with my colleagues around me, or I do it from the phone. So technology is not really part of it. It's much more about the relationships and the interrelationships that people have, the networks that people have. Technology is the facilitator. It's the powerhouse, if you want. It's the way that we can actually enable and empower people to do it. But ultimately, it's the individuals themselves, so the conditions in which an organisation treats social learning are much more effective. Chris's example is a good one. That client in particular already had social learning, social sharing tools in place, and the initiative chose to use what was already there, what was already embedded, people were already using that, and you know, get on the tail of that, rather than trying to create something new. It recognised actually this is happening already, and what we want to do is we want to build on that. But it provided a context through the program. So the blend aspect of it was that the program provided the context for that social interaction. That was then embedded through workplace conversations, which were facilitated and to a degree owned by the employers and by the organisation. But it was done in a much more informal, structured learning way through group coaching sessions and discussions around the problems that that organisation were facing around that aspect of customer complaints and customer care. So to move on and continuing on the theme of the human development aspect of it and who we are as people. Again, much referenced by writers, and I'm sure everybody who's read any paper or any blog or any thought piece around social will have, within the first paragraph, heard Albert Bandura's name bandied around, used as an example and as a definer of what social learning is. I have an argument with that, is that no one really goes beneath the surface. It's almost like we've created a soundbite to some of his research. And I think actually Bandura gives us far more than just a soundbite. His thinking and his work into how we communicate, how we share, how we learn from each other is really insightful and offers us a great opportunity to think about the context of technology and the context of learning in the modern culture, in the modern workplace. So I've done a little bit more digging around Bandura's work, and I think what struck me when I was doing that was this whole concept of personal agency. And what at the heart of that is that Bandura believed that we as humans are adaptable, and that we are constantly dealing with change, and change is part of our social systems, and we deal with that. And life happens around us, and we're part of that life. We're influencing that, and we're being influenced by that. So we are exactly producers of social systems and social change. We're also products of that as well. And how we learn from that, and how we contribute to that, is a key part of who we are as human beings. And ultimately, I think if organisations can understand that humans have this, one, a drive to be social, but two, also have the ability to be social, and to be social in a collaborative, productive, useful way, then the actual whole concept of social learning moves much beyond it being just another product or another offer from the learning and development suite. To truly get it, and to truly enable organisations to do it, I think looking at what Bandura has defined as personal agency is a really useful starting point. Self-organising, proactive, self-reflecting, self-regulating, adaptable, informed social systems, informed by social systems. Well, people can be doing this, and if we set up systems much like 70-20-10, much like that framework, it's thinking, are people able to do this? Do we empower them? Do our systems enable people to be empowered and demonstrate their own personal agency? And it's a question, it's a question mark. But maybe when looking at people and looking at what drives them, is some of the questions that we should be asking when we're thinking and considering how social learning can inform what we do. I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to talk about some other aspects of the human condition, almost.
Yeah, that's very profound, Jez. But yeah, as Bandura focuses on outcomes, the sort of behavioural outcomes, I think the other, and rightly so, but actually also I think it's worth bearing in mind, is the sort of intrinsic, human nature, if you like, in terms of at an emotional level as well, and how social learning can tap into that. I mean, basically, if Bandura suggests that people are effective at, sharing, self-generating, so on and so forth, but crucially, I think people are really generous. Stack Overflow demonstrated that. People are very generous and kind, and that we should tap into that, as this slide suggests. It's the fact that humans could not have survived in nature without the charity and social reciprocity of a group. People are, altruistic and willing to share on the one hand. They're also quite vain. They like to sort of show off their knowledge and share their knowledge. And so perhaps the best way to push social is, in fact, not to call it learning, but to refer to social learning as supporting your colleagues, problem solving, giving advice, sharing expertise and experience. Maybe that's a different way, the way to approach social learning. Don't call it social learning. Don't call it learning at all. Define it as a living thing, a community like Stack Overflow. And there are plenty of existing tools which can help with this, as Krista's going to talk about on the next slide.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, so we've touched on the what and the why. So I was going to talk now a little bit about some how, and I guess we can come at that from two angles. One is technical and one is cultural. So just before we do, if you could type into the chat, how do you share information and knowledge at work? what tools, channels and platforms do you use in your workplace? That would be great and really handy, and we'll come back to that in a second. So, every year Jane Hart does a survey and publishes a list of the top 100 tools for learning. So this is the top 10 of her tools for workplace learning for last year. So if we look at those, some of those really, immediately jump out as social learning tools. There's Yammer, there's Twitter, Skype and Slack. But really, I think probably as Jez has indicated, we could use any of those as social learning tools. So one of the questions, I guess, that everybody is interested in is, that's all well and good, but where is the next big thing coming from? And for me, if I'm asked, I think the next big thing is where social learning intersects with other connected approaches. So, for example, there's Anders Pink or curation tools where social learning and curation meet. And I know that there's a webinar later this week about curation where I'm sure there'll be a demo of Anders Pink. And also, I think a very interesting place to look is where social learning works on the LMS. So, for example, in something like Totoro Social. So, in terms of feedback from the chat, Kelsey, do you have any feedback on the chat about what tools and platforms and channels people are using?
Yeah, we've got email and SharePoint, Link, LYNC, Yammer, phone, Trillium for quick chats, meetings and email, share knowledge mainly by sending an email with a link to a webinar or articles I've read. Google Communities is also on there. Some PowerPoints, YouTube, collaborative groups, IM. Bloomfire has also been mentioned. Articulate Storyline, Slack, Confluence. Some Skype is on there mentioned. YouTube again. Yammer, if I haven't mentioned that one yet. And then there's also some people using things like the intranet.
So there are all sorts of tools,
tools
and platforms and channels that people are using, and presumably quite a lot of those are pre-existing, not necessarily brought in to facilitate social learning. Some of them sound like they have been, but that's a really interesting range of very, very new tools and also, more traditional ones.
And paradoxically, you could argue that massive breadth of technology that's being used demonstrates that the technology is actually not especially important. It's the fact that lots and lots of people are using whatever it takes to learn and share socially.
I mean, I go back to the point I made earlier about, technology really is the same as painting a picture on a cave wall. The reality of it is you use the tools that are to hand. And just we've got an awful lot more tools now. I think that, in some ways, is one of the difficulties that organisations face, is that there's so many tools, there's so much choice, and how can you control that choice? How do you say this tool is better than that tool, and therefore everyone must use it? And that's the argument, and I think that we've been looking at, or the discussion that we've been looking at, and I think it's some of the issues and some of the problems that organisations are struggling with. And I don't know out there if that's something that you're struggling with. Do you own a single tool, or do you just let people do it, and do you let them find their own way, find what works for them, because you trust that they actually, any social interaction is good interaction, and it'll help them do their jobs better. Rhetorical question.
There is one person playing devil's advocate that said, with so many different tool types, do you risk fragmentation? And I think that kind of is leading to, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Susie, but I assume you kind of mean that in the way, if you have too many different tools, do people just get lost in what tool they should be using and getting joined up and get lost in the noise?
And I'd agree, and I think that's the dilemma. The dilemma is, do you own it and control it, and try and control it through sponsored tools, through recognised tools, and hope that people will adopt it and become engaged and empowered by it, or risk losing it because you try to own it and control it. And in some ways, it's a dilemma, and I certainly haven't got an answer to it. And I think there's probably examples of where it's worked and where it's failed. I think we've got probably some examples later of where that approach did fail within an organisation. And again, maybe out there is the difference from people. So, which actually neatly takes me on to that very that very case study. So, thank you for the Blue Pizza link there. That was really useful. So, when things don't go to plan, this is a case study of someone within our network, and it's somebody that I was having some conversations with a while back about social learning and what worked and what didn't. And they shared this story of an organisation that they were working with. Learning development was tasked with the challenge of getting people sharing information and knowledge more. A national organisation, lots of offices, lots of people working remotely. How do they make sure, a bit like the Xerox thing, how do they make sure that best practice is being shared? How do they make sure that people are working together to solve the common problems? And they wanted to nail this. You know, they thought it was really important, and saw that social learning or social learning tools were a great way of doing it. There was evidence, much like I think we demonstrated from the list, social pockets working well across the organisation, but on a vast range of different tools and different approaches. Learning and Development wanted to understand this a little bit more, so they set up a formal pilot group. And within that formal pilot group, they looked at adopting a single platform, a single tool, and they chose Yammer to do that. And within that, within the pilot group, which is quite an important part of it, they selected a group of people, again, nationally diverse, but doing a similar role, doing similar jobs, encountering similar sort of problems, and enabling them to share and utilise the Yammer tool. All went very well. Lots of traffic, lots of issues. Feedback was really good from the pilot group. So feeding back to the powers that be, and indeed quite happy with that. The organisation decided to roll it out across everybody. And social learning is a great thing. Sharing is a great thing. And Yammer was formally adopted. It became the platform. It was the thing that we are going to use. And big community words to that effect was launched. Across the whole business. The CEO got involved. He sponsored it. He started sending email. He started sending correspondence, communication via Yammer to everybody. People responded to it, but very high level. When looked at the results, it was very high level. And after that initial flurry, it soon fitted out and died away. And within about a month of doing it, actually, there was nothing happening. And the whole initiative seemed to fail. And when L&D looked at it and did some analysis, even the successful pilot group, which had reported such good things, had stopped. So the question in my mind was what went wrong with that? What was it that got in the way of creating that? They had the tools. They had obviously the people with the experience and practice of working socially, and it was working reasonably well. It was a good example of good behaviours within the organisation around how it can work. But clearly something went wrong. I would argue that the moment you try to control it, the moment you try to own it, the moment you try to force people down a single route or down a single line of communication, invariably human nature, or it just doesn't work for people, kicks in and people will go their own way and do their own thing anyway. So maybe that was the issue. So I'm going to hand over to Krista, who's going to give us a few more tips.
Or to James.
Or to James.
Depending on...
Yeah. Depending on what we've written on your piece of paper. Yeah.
Whichever way whether you're facing north, south, east, or west. Okay, well, let's just say, you are going to decide. I mean, Kelsey said, fed back from the chat that there was that fear of fragmentation. Let's say you have selected a set number of tools that you're going to launch, if you like, and encourage people to use to create some social learning, or possibly you're going to get a site, one single site together, get it developed, commission a site, or something like that. There are a few tips here which I'll just share with you. I mean, there are millions of tips, but here's some samples. I mean, one thing to do, I talked about not calling it learning. Also, why don't give it, if you don't call it learning, why not give it a name of some kind? Give it a brand. Turn your social initiative into a kind of product in its own right, and something that's preferably, if you do that, that's not associated with anything managerial or anything to do with learning and development or HR or anything like that, completely separate, so that it is of the people, for the people, by the people. So in other words, if you are an L&D or an HR, don't be associated with it. Don't be seen to be associated with it, especially when it comes to the content that exists within it, because that might smack of formal learning, and that's not social learning. Well, one argument can say that. The training that you can usefully seek to provide, I reckon, is not so much the content that I've been talking about, but train people in how to make the best use of the tools that you're going to make available. So, for example, if it is about, I think that's often an obstacle. People don't really feel confident. Yeah, some people feel confident, but not everybody feels confident about being able to upload videos and things like that sort of thing, the kind of stuff they might want to share. So provide that training and promote it. Make it very clear that that training is there to help people go social. And I mean, to be honest, the other thing is that, okay, it might need a bit of a kickstart. So maybe you do seed it a little bit. But if I was you, I'd probably do it by stealth, because I think you're probably going to pretend that you are nothing to do with it. But actually, perhaps you do need to contribute. And if you do go formal in the first place, you could stage some live events to encourage people to sort of get involved at a certain time, at a certain place. And of course, you can sort of feed in content, as I said, possibly by stealth, as if you're a contributor rather than a provider. Krista.
Thank you. Yes, so I guess to widen out from those top tips, we have a set of questions that we often use to think about how to approach social learning before you actually get started, so just as you're dipping your toe in the water. So I guess the first set of questions is around business needs. What do you want to achieve with social learning? Think about what's the motive, why are we doing it now, and what is the success criteria by which we're going to measure it. The next set is around learners and culture, so thinking about where do people already go for help and advice, what are they doing now, and when we think about, so that's I guess around the culture and technically, what kind of social media do people use at work, and what kind of social media are people used to using outside work as well. The next set is around technologies. Are there any areas and platforms for social learning that are currently popular, as we found in that case study from one of our clients? And does your LMS have social learning functionality that you could exploit? The final set of questions around launch and maintenance. So is there maybe a subject area or a group of learners that would lend themselves really well to a pilot? What's the best way to launch something like this? You might have launched campaigns in the past that worked really well, or campaigns that didn't work very well. It's always worth learning from experience, of course. And do you have, and so that's the launch. And in terms of the maintenance and keeping it going, do you have people? Do you have the resources to maintain and moderate something? As James was saying, it's always a good idea to be discreet and stay behind the scenes, but those things still need help carrying them along. So that's just a set of quick questions that we, would think about when we're starting out. Back to you, James.
So I suppose you get to the point of summary, really. We've been rabbiting on about this for nearly 50 minutes now, so we're getting into probably the last conclusions from here. I'm not going to read what's on the screen. You can see that for yourselves. I think what I'm trying to do is to some ways summarise and think about how we look at social learning and how we think about it within Kineo. It's not about tools. It's not about trying to create systems and processes. It's about allowing it and letting it happen naturally, and letting the flow of information and happen naturally within an organisation. It seems that we're, as people, as humans, we're pretty good at doing it. And we have been pretty good at doing it for a long time. And what we're trying to do is just make it easier, give people the tools to do it, but maybe not own it and not control it. It seems that some of the the examples and some of the case studies that we've seen and we've even talked about today is that the more that you tinker with it, the more that you try to own and control it, the more you try to make it an intervention, or like an old training, like a training course would have been, the greater risks you run of quashing it and quashing that natural process of social interaction which happens day to day. So ultimately, we should look at technology as a vehicle, as an enabler, and certainly not think about it as a stick. People must use a certain type of technology. You know, fair enough on the points of how do you make sure that there's consistency, and how do you make sure that it's happening in a way which people know and understand. And I think that's one of the dilemmas and one of the issues that we and you will probably have to tackle and play around with when it comes to actually thinking about social learning and how to get the best out of it and make the most of it within your organisation. Independently, and what is absolutely fundamental for me is that learning happens, and that we as humans are learning all the time for every experience that we're having. What we should be trying to do as learning organisations is enable people to understand that and make sense of the learning that's going on around, but we should be supporting them to make that learning happen for themselves, and using technology, using curation, using discussion boards, using virtual sessions to help people make sense of the massive information that is out there, so they can use it to their best. So really it is about social, it's less about learning process as such. We shouldn't necessarily be looking to formalise and to create formal structures. I think it's definitely much more about how do we engage people socially, and how do we empower and enable them to do that. So encouragement, trust, empowerment, personal agency, for me they're the probably quite nebulous and quite philosophical concepts that underpin it. But ultimately what we've got to try and do is that we've got to give people the tools to do it, but don't over-engineer it. Don't try and control it. Don't try and push people down a particular avenue or particular line. James, is there any closing points that you'd like to make? I put James on the spot there. He thought he'd finished for the afternoon, but I'm just going to give him the opportunity.
No, but you have avoided the word obstacle, which is in the quote, I must admit. But I think it's really is about removing obstacles. I think in the workplace, when it comes to L&D or anything really, there are loads and loads of obstacles, things that get in the way, and I think actually it's about looking at all the obstacles and then systematically getting rid of them. And the second thing I would say is come back to my point about removing the obstacles and then providing the training at a very sort of basic level in terms of how to use and make best use of the tools, and leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks for that, James. And so we come to the end of this webinar, and like to just put the contact out there. We've written a white paper on social learning, which can be downloaded from our website.
You can see the URL. It's bit.ly and social-white paper. If you want to download that directly without going to our website and hunting for it, you can find it right there. I can also just put the link in the chat for you real quick.
Great.
Fast enough.
Thanks, Kelsey. We're available, and we're more than happy to have conversations around social. It's something that we are passionate about as Kineo, but we're passionate about in terms of not necessarily looking at tools, but looking at how to support and enable organisations to use technology better, technology that exists, technology that you've already invested in to build social learning cultures, as opposed to just building a tool and just hoping that people will use it. If people want to reach out and make contact with me, my details are there, and I'm more than happy to either support you directly or act as facilitator within Kineo to give you the right people to speak to. So before we formally close, I'll open it up to the discussion board and see if there's any questions that people have that maybe you want to ask either myself or James. Unfortunately, Chris has had to leave us, so it is down to It's down to James and myself.
Yeah. While we wait for some questions to come in, there was a really interesting point made when we were talking about the definition of social learning, and there was an interesting response saying, I cannot come up with an overall definition, but in my organization, we work with finding communities. We are trying to create learning environment where people engage in groups where they are obliged to contribute with knowledge and experience. They are given different responsibilities in the group to drive discussions, knowledge sharing, etc. And I said, I asked if she found it challenging, and she said, technology-wise, yes, it is difficult. It has also taken some time to convince everyone of the benefits. The learning culture in my organization has been based on documentation and control. This is the complete opposite.
Yeah, it's well, we're there. We're at that last point that I made about obstacles, and but two things I said basically are there in that one message. There's the challenges around the technology. I assume that's in helping people to use that technology, and secondly, getting over the obstacles in the organisation. And as I would go back to the other point, maybe one way around that is to not describe it. To think about a different way of framing what you're trying to achieve, a different way of positioning it. That whereby people don't feel quite so opposed to it, I guess, or resistant to it.
I think the other interesting thing for me is that, and what I've seen here with clients who have adopted social learning and it's worked well, and the case study that Chris talked through is where there is a vehicle for it and where there is actually a purpose and a driver towards it. The reality of it is that we have all created our own ways of networking, of social interaction already, and in some ways that learning is coming a bit late to the party, I think. So I think that in reality what we've got to try and do is use exactly what's been described there, as a vehicle, and maybe as a more formal vehicle, like in the case study, where it was about solving a problem, it was a common problem that people had. There was a degree of compunction towards solving that problem, and people were engaged in it. But they were engaged in a way which wasn't stick engagement, it was much more carrot. It was much more about helping and how can you do your job better, how can you make your life easier, versus you must do this because we're auditing it and we're saying so. Is there anything else, Kelsey?
Yeah, we have two questions I think that I can see. One was, how can social learning be made part of e-learning?
Okay, and the other one?
Do you have any examples of this approach being tried in mandatory training with a regulatory background?
Okay, how can social learning be made part of e-learning? It's quite a difficult question to answer because in a way, social learning can be e-learning, and sort of e-learning could become social learning. Except I'm saying really, let's try and ditch the learning word, even if it's more like learning in brackets. I think the best way to answer that is that in terms of the blended solution, so that where perhaps once upon a time we might have thought we'll just have entirely an e-learning solution to this particular problem, actually we'll do a little bit of a blended solution to it. So we'll have a bit of e-learning, but maybe a part of the solution can be a social part. So I don't think it's a case of making the e-learning social or making the social e-learning. Maybe it's about sort of the two complementing each other as part of the overall solution. Is that a decent answer?
I think you're on. For me, James, I think what it is the e-learning is the driver. It's the core, the hub of the wheel, if you like. And I think what we've got to try and do, and this is about us as e-learning designers as much as anything else, is look for ways which social learning can be reflected in our e-learning design, and that we can use e-learning as a vehicle for people to collaborate, to communicate, to share experiences, versus it being a passive individual engagement with the information that's on the screen. And that's difficult, and I think that's hard to do. I think it's a hard challenge for organisations, but I also think it's a hard challenge for us as traditional, established learning designers as well.
So what you could have is a shorter than you might expect piece of e-learning that's basically quite open-ended, that raises a number of questions, that doesn't sort of come up with all the answers, and actually encourages people to then head out into a social context. Maybe you set up a particular discussion forum on a chosen social tool that people are encouraged to go to from the e-learning.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that would be quite a nice little design.
What are one of our projects that won Social and Collaborative Award, they had it where they had e-learning within their campaign, and part of that e-learning would then be you do a little bit, and then you'd go into a social forum essentially, and can carry that on, and that worked really well for them. They had amazing results from that, obviously because they won an award for it.
Absolutely.
But that was a part of their model.
That sounds great.
They integrated the e-learning into their campaign.
So maybe let us know if that is a reasonable response to your question.
And I think, bearing in mind we're in the last 30 seconds, I think that
Part two.
to answer the second question is probably a very similar answer to the first question in reality. It's not so much about there's a systematic way of doing it. I think that what it is saying that it's about the design of the learning needs to change to reflect social. So we need to think about how do we introduce social elements into learning design versus trying to create a social tool within learning, within an e-learning module, within a particular course. It's actually how do we become more social and how do we encourage people to use what actually they do naturally. So I think that brings us to a conclusion. So thank you very much all for joining us. If there is any further questions, please feel free to either post them now. We'll monitor the comments board for as long as we can. But alternately, feel free to email me direct or use the Twitter feed, and we will post a response to those people that have engaged and joined us today, and those on the list.
Cheers. Yeah. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye bye.
We'll forward on any of the questions that were remaining, and Jez and James can tackle those and feed them back to you. So I hope you all have a great day, and I hope you join us for the rest of our week of webinars.